Our season continues inside the Republic fleet on the bridge of Admiral Coburn's flagship. Cody, Coburn, Ahsoka, Zala, Anakin, and Natabre were trying to figure out where they needed to go. The same planets that they had analyzed on Zaja kept coming up as they tried to figure out where the Starforge could be. It was clear the Sith came here to find the weapon, so if it wasn't here, then where could it be? The planets they were still looking at were Ganaria, Ferrari, Ratatak, and Tupla. All of them were a short jump away, and there was a fear of sending out a smaller group to those planets. It was even more apparent than ever before that the Sith were hot in the trail of Starforge. If they were out here, then someone knew something. With Kit Fisto's fleet so close, they needed to regroup and form up. What would likely be the largest fleet in the Republic Navy, aside from those that defended the key worlds like Kamino. Skywalker pointed to the map and suggested that they find their planet and move out. Coburn was very quick to deny that. There'd be no point in relocating the entire fleet if they didn't know where they were going. There was still the potential that what they were looking for could be on this planet. Natabre refuted that. If the weapon was still here, their search for it was pointless, because if it was on the planet, then the chances are it had already been destroyed over the years, probably crashing down on the surface. That was a fair point, but there was no readings of anything on the ground. Coburn had groups of scouts scouring the planet ever since their victory, and yet there were no signs of it. Though not for nothing, it didn't help that they didn't have a genuine idea of what they were looking for. The weapon was massive according to the ancients, but what else was there? The Republic had no clue if it was actually massive, or if it was just fake, or if the people just made it up, and it didn't actually exist. The air in the room felt so stale. Their eagerness to bring the war to an end felt so tangible, but now it was just slipping away like the myth of the Starforge itself. Not far away from Lanera, Lord Exar exited his starship, with the shuttle full of his best troops. The weapon stood right before their very eyes. With a damaged flagship, the potential for true power and complete intergalactic domination stood at his fingertips. He was so lucky that Revan was all the wiser to suggest keeping the Sith fleets separated. Exar knew Revan would fall for the trap. Not for nothing, Exar had been picking up on the alliance between Revan and Bane, and keeping them separated was the key to making this work. He believed highly in himself. Despite his early failures as a military leader, he knew he would find the weapon first. The perfect way to keep all the other Sith Lords away from him was having someone else suggest the fleets not all meet up at the location of the Starforge, rather keep the space around it safe from the Republic and or potential threats from the Separatists. It was a brilliant maneuver, and while if his reading comprehension skills were better, he would have gotten here sooner, it didn't matter. The Republic had no clue where he was. All they had was a few potential surrounding planets that they could go to from Lanera. Exar's shuttle slowly cruised towards the massive structure. It was magnificent. He couldn't help but think of the Sith Empire fully under his control. The shuttle got closer and closer, and they realized all the bay doors had been locked down. Exar made his way to the bridge of the shuttle and used the force to pry open the doors long enough for the shuttle to land. He noted that it hadn't been turned on in likely over a millennia, so it was freezing on the inside of the structure. Not to mention the air quality, while intact, was terrible. It wasn't quite dead air, but it was as close as it could get to being dead air. Exar told his men to fan out and find the on switch for the station. They looked at him, and all in sequence nodded their heads as they exited the shuttle. The cold and eeriness of the structure only left their imaginations to wonder what the hell awaited them on the inside of it. They started forward, splitting up into two groups to scour the structure. Exar walked down the ramp last. He felt the chill the moment he exited the shuttle. He knew it would take time for him to find the switch to turn it on, so he lifted his wrist and told the captain of the flagship to prepare the boarding sequence so they could have all their troops situated. The flagship no longer mattered to him. All that mattered was what he could create. Once the orders were issued, he turned and started down the hallway. The interior of the ship was slightly decayed. It wasn't terrible, being that one could still breathe inside the facility. In the hallways were broken panels, wires sitting on the ground, holes in the floor and walls. Though the most important thing is that the exterior of the Starforge was undamaged. Exar got to an elevator shaft and used the force to fling the doors open. He looked at the elevator, which was sitting on the floor below him. He gently trotted across it and used it to push himself upwards. He ignited his lightsaber and slammed it into the wall as he leapt from side to side inside the elevator shaft before reaching a point he believed to have what he was looking for. Exar blasted the doors open with the force and rolled into the room. When he got out of his roll, he climbed off of his knees to his feet and looked around the room. He could see the planet Tupla, and then he realized that he was on the bridge. His smile widened and he looked around. This was an older device, which meant that all of its controls, or at least the gears to get it jump-started, would be physical rather than computer-operated, which was great for him, because all of his engineers and deckhands were collectively stupid. He walked around the bridge and looked for a lever. He found one, but it wasn't just one lever. There was a couple of them in a row. The dialects above the levers wasn't exactly legible, mostly because it was all decayed, but also it was in a completely different language. Exar just treaded lightly. He grabbed the first lever and pulled it down. He could feel the engines on the weapon churning. He continued to pull the next one down. A couple moments later, he had all the levers pulled down, and a violent-sounding horn raged over the entire facility. It caused the captain of the flagship to put the shields up, and every single acolyte inside the facility to drop to the ground. The lights inside the facility flickered, and then it came back to life. Though some of the electrical wires had been misplaced and began sparking, which would be problematic for people who like to play with electricity. Exar looked at the panels on the bridge as they lit up with data and schematics for tons of things he couldn't even understand. He called back to the captain and requested that every single engineer and deckhand came to his location, tapping on a button on his wrist that activated a signal for them to follow. It would take several minutes, but the individuals would usher themselves to the broken frame door and get to work. Exar, while they were doing this, started looking elsewhere in the facility. He wanted a throne room, and luckily enough, he found one at the top of the structure. It was a little difficult to get to, but he'd rather it be difficult to get to rather than not be here. What was even better is that it was outfitted with a control center, so he could have his engineers working for him inside of his throne as he watched his fleet grow. Hours would pass by on Tupla until everything was set up the way he wanted it. Everything was translated into Galactic Common so we could understand it, and the instructions for the weapon were given over to him. All he had to do was kill a star. Exar got up from his throne and walked to the front of the room and looked down at the planet. He turned to his deckhands and told them to begin the ignition of the Starforge. Destroy the sun of the lens system. Every single sentient being in this part of the galaxy would die. But he didn't care. It would fuel his super weapon and his aspirations for galactic dominance. The power surge started, and the massive weapon began to shift on its axis, directing itself outwards towards the sun, which was in the center of the star system. And within moments, a grinding could be heard. The power of the sun was being sucked into the structure. Exar stood on the bridge, laughing as he watched the sun die before his very eyes. The Sith acolytes from his flagship stood in his throne room idly waiting for the next directive, but all they could do was listen to his insidious snarl as he stood overlooking the death of a star. Orbiting Lanera was a republic, and one of the deckhands on Coburn's flagship indicated that they were picking up a massive surge from deep within a system or two over. Coburn asked what it was, and the deckhand admitted that he was unsure, but the readings were off the charts. Everything was out of place with this. He noticed that the energy was similar to that of what came from a star, but instead of it releasing that energy, it was being sucked up. He didn't know what it was, but it seemed like the energy of a star was being transferred to another location within the system. Skywalker turned over to Coburn and asked if it was a planet or a structure. The deckhand didn't know. It could be either. It looked like it was a structure by the readouts, but it was too close to a planet, if it was a structure, to be identified. Coburn turned to the group and told them that it was time to relocate. Natabre called out, asking about Fisto's fleet, and Coburn, while not known for his aggressive strategy and style, told her they didn't have time to waste. General Fisto would have to meet them there. The fate of the galaxy would be decided in this contest. Natabre and Anakin knew it, but with Coburn ready for action, he called back the recon groups who were still searching for the weapon on the ground and gave out a fleet layout. He didn't know what to expect upon their arrival, but if this weapon was as deadly as it was rumored to be, they needed something quick, so he delved into the usage of a pincer movement. The fleet quickly turned on their afterburners and began piecing itself together. By the time the fleet was ready, the recon fighters had returned back to the hangar bays, and the fleet jumped into hyperspace. Once the fleet was in hyperspace, Coburn personally contacted General Fisto and told him of the unfolding situation and expressed that they couldn't have waited. Plus, he believed the element of survives from their fleet would be all the more helpful for their attack on the weapon. With General Fisto arriving late, they had that element of surprise. Skywalker and Morden had gotten out most of their grievances and emotions before the previous battle, believing it was the end. So, instead of doing that again, they just stood by each other's side on the bridge, sitting over a holomap as a couple deckhands on the consoles tried to piece together what they believed the battlefield to look like. They didn't know who or what was there, so they were basing their fleet layout of their opponent off of previously recorded battles from the war. Cody did assume that the Sith fleet was just a flagship from the previous battle, but to be cautious, or at least prepared, they had a makeshift fleet set up prepared for their arrival. Anakin and Natabre were standing so close that their shoulders were touching, but no one noticed it. Ahsoka and Zala were in the youngling training room, getting each other hyped up. They knew how important this mission was, and if they weren't prepared, then they would fail. They could not do that, which is why they were together. It was that they understood each other being the same age, so they having each other through this encounter would be incredibly important for their own sanity. They both had a lot of nerves, and while they had no intention of wearing themselves out, they needed to get those nerves out of their system. If they didn't, then they'd be way too tense for the battle that they were going into. Over Tupla, Exar watched the rest of the star die, and the Leon system went dark. He could see the planet below go cold. It would take time for everything down there to die, but he got up from his throne and walked over to the control panel. While the star was being destroyed by the Star Forge, Exar had his engineers design some vessels that could be built. At the same time, he also requested for a number of droids to be built. They obviously didn't have the crew to fill up those vessels that they were about to build, so they needed to come up with some designs. Luckily, the Sith had a couple assassin droids that they could use as baselines, like HK units, though the programming would have to be a little bit different, which wasn't a big deal to them anyways. The engineers just took everything inside the HK programming and redesigned it. There were different variations. There were basic troop variants, but the main was just the operational droids, with the sole purpose of operating all the vessels that had been designed by the engineers. Ever since they learned about the Star Forge and its capabilities, they had been designing and redesigning everything they planned on using and building. Obviously, this was shared between the Sith, though Exar had something else. He had planned his own design, which had been worked on for forever, and while the star was being destroyed, it was being updated and completed. It was the most perfect vessel he had ever seen. It was a vessel that made the massive Separatist warship that was defeated over Coruscant look small. While the Malevolence was a massive cruiser, Exar wanted a starship that in of itself would make up an entire fleet, one that could rip through anything the Republic threw at it, though he knew it would take time for the Star Forge to pump out a vessel of such magnitude. So instead of focusing on it first, he would have the support fleet created. He knew that the shields on the older vessel was already weak, so there's no need for him to damn himself with a half-completed super ship for the potential arrival of an enemy fleet. Exar had no reason to believe the Republic would track him here, but his ignorance wasn't so overbearing that he wouldn't prepare himself for such an encounter, especially being a Sith. The support fleet would be larger than the previous fleet he had over Lanera. There was also another benefit that the Sith would have. Being that they were using blueprints of the HK units they'd used throughout the duration of this war, the new droids would be outfitted with the memory chips possessed by every member of the Sith military. They knew every strategy, every success, every defeat, anything the Sith needed to achieve victory would be obtained before they were built. This too included how Lord Nihilus was able to lure Skywalker into a trap on Thifera and take advantage of his youthfulness. Exar told the operators to fire up the forge, and the engines began cranking. A hole opened up in the side of it, and Exar walked over to the viewport on his bridge and looked out at the massive vessel as it was pumping out weapons of mass destruction. He prided himself on these accomplishments. He turned to the Sith and told them that their Sith Empire would be the greatest the galaxy had ever seen. No one would stop them. The reactions from the various Sith were different. While no one could choose which Sith they were assigned to, these Sith had varying degrees of loyalty to Lord Exar. He was a bit of a nuisance to work for, though nothing could be as bad as what it was for Revan, considering the little uprising that was slowly going around the Sith lines in gossip and rumor. These Sith all looked at their lord and acknowledged him, with the chant that they were forced to say whenever Exar wanted a response. His ego needed it, and so they ripped out a chant in his name and in his honor as he stood there with a twisted grin on his face. He turned back as they continued the chant and watched two more ships come out. As the Star Forge got acquainted with being turned on again, the Forge was able to produce more vessels at a higher volume. The captain of the flagship, as per his orders from the Sith Lord, began to issue out fleet commands to each of the new ships and to a defense line. He knew that if the Republic fleet would come, then they would likely try a strategy that worked against the previous fleet. He hadn't had much success as of late, and the captain had every intention of changing that. The new fleet would also be much larger than anything he ever had to work with, and in mere minutes, he was already at the helm of an impressive fleet. As hours crept by, his fleet was triple the size of what he lost on Lanera. The benefit of a fleet like this is he could also sacrifice any ships he needed to. Not that he didn't already do the same thing when the ships were helmed by sentient beings. Regardless, with the fleet finally finished, Exar was able to begin the construction on his Sith Super Destroyer. He was also excited for a ship like this because no one, not even within the ranks of the Sith, would be able to stop it, and Nihilus would be very ineffective against it, considering every operator on the ship was robotic. There was nothing anyone would be able to do to stop him. It may have been the constant curse for the Sith, the continuous lust for power. Exar, like any Sith in the Sith Empire, wanted power, but his curse, just as it was for the others around him, was how he would throw anyone under a Star Cruiser to get what he wanted. The Star Forge was his means to total victory. His adversaries, of course, were the Republic and the CIS, but nothing was greater of a threat to him than the other Sith, the ones who were constantly around him and had the power to upend his reign as Sith Emperor or Sith Lord, or whatever it is that he liked to refer to himself as. His lust for greater power led him to the weapon that would grant him such powers, All it took was to complete a fleet, and then he could blindside each Sith fleet surrounding him. In all actuality, Revan's little diagnosis of the star map gave Exar two advantages. Firstly, the advantage to build his fleet. Secondly, the ability to ambush each and every Sith Lord who ever dared challenge him or his rule. No matter his mess-ups, they were all calculations to Exar, because he could not lose. He would not lose. He was the one and only true Sith Lord, and that's all that mattered to him. Exar looked down from his throne as the tip of the Sith Super Destroyer started to peek out of the forge itself. His smile widened. In due time, his superweapon would be complete. The best part about the forge is that every single one of the vessels could be completed and outfitted with a proper crew at the same time, so he never had to worry about taking his time to move droids into the vessels that they would be commanding. It was all going to perfection for Lord Exar. Inside the hangar bay of Coburn's Venator, the Jedi were preparing to get into their vessels so they could exit once they arrived at hyperspace. Skywalker was simply waiting to go ahead from the Admiral. Commander Cody was in the area. He was talking to Skywalker and Morden about some more unorthodox ideas he had. After all, he figured that one should be able to adapt, and considering Skywalker was so, well, different, he figured he might as well try and meet him where he was. Maybe not on the same level of insanity, but a risk here or there wouldn't be too terrible in Cody's eyes. As they were talking, the fleet dropped out of hyperspace. Anakin got up and walked over to a wall and pressed on the control module, and an image of the frontal perspective of the flagship popped up. Natabre looked at it from over his shoulder as he stepped back, and the two Jedi Masters and Cody looked at it with a bit of shock and a lot of worry. This fleet was huge. Anakin turned back and told Cody that they would need those unorthodox ideas right now. Cody looked at the two Jedi generals and his eyes darted over to the droids. Natabre asked what that was supposed to mean. He kind of shrugged his shoulders. He told them that their astromechs were kind of the best in the fleet. Anakin kind of saw where he was going with this and then asked Cody what the plan of attack was. Cody grinned and walked over to the screen on the wall and pointed to the far starboard side of the flank. He told them that a wing of gunships would be all they needed. It would allow more troops to actively get involved in the battle. He didn't know how many troops their ships manned, but considering that their flagship was the only one here, he couldn't imagine that their fleet was highly manned by troops. Anakin asked how he noticed, and Cody's analytical mind went into overdrive. The ships that were produced by the Starforge didn't have the same design as the same ships from Lanera. He wasn't saying that no one was crewing the ships, but he was suggesting that the clones could sneak aboard a couple of their destroyers on the far side of their flank. They could get to the bridge and not only open up a broadside, but they could turn their engines on full blast and evacuate the ships. Anakin didn't love the idea, but if they could do it effectively, which he believed Cody could, then he was all for it. Anakin turned to Natabre, but she had already turned over and whistled to her astromech. R2-D2 and R4-83 rolled over. The Jedi told them that they'd be with the commander for the duration of the battle. They whistled at their Jedi, but they had to go. The battle was about to begin. Anakin and Natabre got to their cockpits and hopped in. They asked their Padawans if they were ready, and both Ahsoka and Zala showed relative calmness in their voices, which was just another motivation boost for the generals. Though something took all that motivation away. Skywalker called up to Admiral Coburn and asked for the all clear. The Admiral was genuinely frozen on the bridge. All of his confidence leading up to this moment had been thwarted. How were they supposed to fight this fleet? It typically wasn't a game of numbers, but this was an overbearing force. All the captains along with Admiral Yularen were standing on their decks with the same frozen expressions. Natabre called Coburn's name and got nothing from him. They were looking at the vast fleet of Sith vessels just sitting across the battlefield from them. Anakin asked Natabre what they should do, and she turned her head towards him and threw her arms up. Coburn came back to his mind and told them that they'd be retreating from this battle. They could not do this. Without missing a beat, fire came from Natabre, and she told him that they didn't have time to retreat. If the Sith were capable of constructing this in the time it took for them to get here, imagine how much they could create with extra time. Anakin chimed in behind her and expressed how all they needed to do was hold on until Fisto's fleet arrived at hyperspace. Coburn snapped back into reality. He looked in front of him. Waves of Sith fighters were abandoning their hangar bays and making their way for the pursuit of Republic lions. He called over the communications and ordered every single ship in the fleet to launch. They needed to counter-assault. He handed the reins over to the Jedi generals. At the same time, Cody informed him that he began working on the plan he devised. Coburn was a little iffy on the idea. At the moment, the Admiral was considering using the Republic gunships as a means to support the Republic fleet. Anakin and Natabre did a very quick check-in as they got out of the Venators and took a look at the approaching fighters. Coburn had a couple of anti-fighter corvettes at the ready and told the generals that when they were ready, he would deploy them, though he made it clear that they were currently out of range of the Sith fleet. When they moved in, they'd be stuck in battle. The Jedi understood this, and Natabre called out, asking all the troops to get in formation. Ahsoka and Zala formed up on the exterior flanks to their respective masters, as the V-19s and the other Republic vessels got into formation behind their Jedi generals. Inside the Venators, Cody rounded up a number of men and got them prepared for what they were going to be doing. R2 and R4 were sitting next to him. He gave out his orders and quickly ushered men into position. Inside of Yularen's flagship, Rex was doing the exact same thing. Everything was going to plan at the moment, as the troops were gathered up and the Republic fleet launched their gunships and pushed them to the back of their lines, as a means to get them around the side of the flank. The main hope being that the Sith fleet wasn't monitoring for gunships once the fleet battle began, though time would tell once the actual combat started. Coburn lined up all the heavy hitters and then positioned each of the light cruisers behind them to be exactly what they were, support ships. He watched the Sith fleet hold steady and allowed the fighters to get into range. Despite the Y-Wings being bombers, they'd be joining the fighter assault. Every single cannon would be necessary, and considering the Republic Y-Wing was a two-man crewed vessel with a gunner's position, it'd be absolutely necessary if the Republic wanted to achieve victory. The calm before the storm wasn't long-lasting, and the Republic fighters were quickly ushered into combat with the Sith Empire. The droid fighters produced by the Star Forge were effective fighters, but clone pilots were trained to be the best in the galaxy. Clones and Jedi matched up extremely well as they continued to rip apart the Sith fighters as the battle began. It wasn't even at all. Despite the effectiveness of the clones and Jedi, they were incredibly outnumbered. Admiral Coburn knew this, and he had already begun the advancement of the fleet, which allowed the fleet battle to begin. But it also allowed the anti-fighter Republic corvettes to boost their engines and enter the fray. On the backside of the flank, waves of LAAT gunships pushed hard to the starboard side of the fleet. Anakin and Natabre were cutting through in tandem, and they, as they were fighting, were able to get different times during the fight to catch a glimpse of their students. It was calming to know that they were handling themselves adequately. With the Republic heavy cannons in range, the battle was in full throttle. The Sith fleet was unwavering. While they were actively firing, their ranks didn't change. The captain of the Sith flagship designed the battle to go this way. The middle of the line was heavily defended. This in turn allowed the flagship to remain defended while also keeping the Star Forge at a distance from the action. This bulk would allow the Sith to actively defend the superweapon until the Sith Super Destroyer was completed. With the battle continuing to intensify with fighters having to avoid being clipped by turbo lasers, Zala flew her vessel a little too close to the Sith lines. The worst part for her wasn't the consequences of being this close to the Sith fleet. It was what she was able to see from the corner of her eye. She could see a massive hole inching out of the Star Forge, and the sight of it nearly forced her to crash into a Sith cruiser. Thankfully, her astromech was paying more attention. Zala called out over the transmission and told her allies that the Sith forces had a massive cruiser crusher coming out of the weapon. The fear radiated throughout her voice and got the attention of every single member inside the comm chatter. Skywalker told Zala to return to combat. He and Natabre would make their way over to investigate. As the two generals tried to make their way over towards the Star Forge, the Admiral acknowledged the massive energy reading that they were getting. Truthfully, no one had noticed due to the sheer size of the fleet already present in front of them. When they realized what was being constructed, they knew they needed to act quicker. Coburn couldn't panic in the moment. Instead of panicking, he asked where Cody and his troopers were. The clone trooper expressed that they were preparing their boarding procedure. Luckily, as of yet, the far side of the Sith flank hadn't actually picked up the number of smaller vessels moving towards their bow. All their sensors were reading for larger ships and targeting larger ships. Skywalker radioed over to Natabre and told her that perhaps they could go that way and shut down the Star Forge from the inside. If the fleet couldn't get into range, it'd be a security blanket. Natabre expressed that he was reading her mind. Coburn obviously heard this, but he didn't disagree with the notion. The Sith forces were holding a strong defense against the Republic, and in reality, these ships produced by the Star Forge were up to the standard of Venators, or the base ship for the Separatist lines. Without any previous schematics for these vessels, the clones were forced into fighting it out on the go. Skywalker and Morden cut through the Sith lines. Ironically, because the droids hadn't had any experience with combat firsthand, when the Jedi starfighters passed by them, they opened fire on the ships. Due to their close proximity to each other, their heavy cannons ended up firing into the ships next to them. At the same time, wings of LAATs began entering a line of heavy flak. The vessels that weren't carrying any troops for the landing procedures broke down the middle of the flank. The pilots knew how important this mission was, and their only goal was to defend the troop carriers. This inevitably led to a number of clone pilots getting clipped and shot down by the heavy cannons of the Sith flagships. But this was to be expected. LAATs were much larger than regular fighter craft. Once the LAATs got close to the hangar bays, they were able to begin a landing procedure on 3 of the ships. The reason they were able to get into 3 is that they were back to back to back. It was an angled defense, which meant that if a ship fell in the front lines, then they could simply turn on their engines and replace said destroyed ship. Clones exited out of their LA-ATs and quickly ran through the hallways. Their guns were drawn as Cody and Rex, for the first time in their careers, met up on the battlefront. On one of the ships, Clone Trooper Nell of Rex's division led a collection of troopers forward. On the third ship, Waxer, Boyle, and Lucky were the leaders of that assault. The clones were effective, and the few active droids inside each of these vessels were mostly manning the bridge operations, though there were a few patrols to deal with. As each of the clone units quickly moved through the vessels, they encountered little resistance. The troops were not regular troops. Exar had planned for sentry-type droids to be installed in each ship. He really liked the Droideka model and decided to replicate it on a larger scale. He wanted the ships to be defendable without needing actual infantry, unless of course said infantry was being transported for a land battle. The clones had to hide away in the hallways as firefights began. Cody and Rex, just as their brothers were doing inside the other ships, held their backs to the walls and began firing over. They tried using droid poppers, but considering they hardly worked against droidekas, the clones had to have the perfect roll, which was not possible in such a long hallway. Rex and Cody were at the edge of each hallway and they looked to each other, laying down fire, but seeing the shields not getting destroyed meant the clones had to get creative. Rex called forward one of his men with a rocket and jumped into the hallway blasting forward. The rocket didn't fully damage the droid, it was still firing away the clones. Cody noticed a hole made in the wall from the explosion and he told the men to cover him as he darted out into the hallway. One of the legs of the battle droid was damaged, so his firing wasn't perfect, simply due to a slight tilt. Cody ran forward into the hall and jumped forward, avoiding a couple blaster shots. He slammed into the ground and climbed to his feet. As he did, Rex opened fire on the droid, giving it another target. The super droid turned his attention towards Rex, clipping him in the pauldron, and he shot back. He was uninjured, but the distraction gave Cody enough time to get up to the droid and drop a droid popper under its shields and duck away. Throughout the ship, the clones had to continue this process. Just outside the ship, the spare LA-ATs joined the fighter assault, using their rockets and blasters to help clear up a path for fighters. The V-19s were doing a solid job, but the Y-Wings were the fragile ship of the group. They were large and slow. With the assistance of the LA-ATs and the Republic anti-fighter corvettes, the bombers were able to not just get through the fray and assist the fighter fight, but also able to lay down some heat onto the heavy hitters of the Sith fleet. All the while, Natabre and Anakin were able to slide past enemy lines, as they made their way towards the hangar bay of the Star Forge. They got a good look at the hull of the Sith Super Destroyer. It was massive, and it would be able to rip through the Republic fleet with no issue. Anakin and Natabre sped into an empty hangar bay on the front side of the Star Forge. With the space battle intensifying around them, they had one mission: shut down the weapon. They escaped their vessels and encountered several of the battle droids stationed to maintain sentry in the hangar. Exar studied these Jedi strategies, and despite how little he expected of the Jedi, he still wanted to be prepared for them if they made a daring move such as this. The heavy droids with shields were allowed to handle, but with a technique of force and lightsaber throw, the two of them were able to make their way out of the hangar bay. In essence, one of them would use all their force power to lob the droid backwards, and then the other one would launch their lightsaber into the droid, destroying it because their shields would be shot down by the force. The two Jedi worked in tandem as they moved from hangar bay into the hallways and came across a number of individual droids built like HK units. Anakin and Natabre rushed forward. Truthfully, the hallway was their ally. They just used it to their advantage. They moved forward in unison, without missing a beat. Where the other missed a block, the other caught it. The two of them at such a young age worked like masters, slowly getting their way to the droid lines and cutting through them. As they began working their way through the droid forces, they got to a point where they thought they were clear. The hallways dimmed with a red glow, and a voice called over the intercoms of the super weapon. It was the same voice that taunted Skywalker when he saved Zala. The man told Skywalker and Natabre that they would die, and their deaths would mark the beginning of the end for the Jedi, for the Republic, and for the galaxy without a rule of Sith. He expressed the joy he would feel in watching their excruciating deaths come at the hands of his troopers. The sound of lightsabers igniting got Anakin and Natabre's attention, as they both looked down opposite ends of the hallways and saw singular Sith at the end of each of them. As the Sith stepped forward, droids rounded the corners from each side, and as they came around the corner, they got together in formation of 2 by 2, similar to what the Jedi had just cut down. The two Jedi turned to each other, their eyes met for a solitary moment. They both reached out towards the other and grabbed the other's forearm before looking into the other's eyes again. Not a word needed to be said. The sound of marching in the hallway became an echo chamber of terror. Natabre turned her back first, and Anakin followed suit not more than a moment afterwards, putting his back against hers. They at the same exact time said the word, ready. They moved forward, the warmth of each other's back fading the moment they separated. Skywalker spun his blade around in his hand and looked at the acolyte preparing to challenge him. The acolyte grinned under his mask as he ran forward. Skywalker rose to the challenge, keeping a steady pace, allowing the Sith to gain some speed and momentum. Anakin ducked down, avoiding a strike before spinning back and swinging forward. His blade slammed against the acolytes before pulling back. His heavy parry allowed him to turn back and launch a force at the droids marching down the hallway towards him. He smiled with a devious but cocky grin before swinging forward towards the acolyte, going as hard and aggressive as he possibly could. Mordin, on the other hand, waited for the acolyte to come to her. She was dainty in her usage of form too, and she allowed the swordsman to engage her. The first 2 steps she made were backwards, 2 perfect blocks before she spun forward, her hair moving with a solitary motion behind her as she flipped her blade into a reverse grip. She parried another strike, pushing back. The droids behind her opened fire, and she was caught between an acolyte and the battle droids. Natabre reached out and pulled 2 panels off the wall and slammed him into the ground before blocking a strike that nearly removed her head. Her brows firmed, and she thrusted her blade forward. The echoes of the lightsabers at the end of each hallway made the fighting even more intense. The battle droid Skywalker knocked over were moving forward again, but he got a hold of the battle versus his acolyte. He swung under their blade and blasted upwards, throwing the Sith blade into the air. He then shoulder-checked the Sith before dragging his blade across the ground, slashing sparks into the Sith's face, blinding him even behind the mask, before he ripped through his chest with the blade. Anakin turned towards the droids coming for him and blocked the shots being fired. Natabre got into a quick but light engagement with the Sith again. Their blades moved with quickness and precision. She blocked a strike that threw her hand to the side, which she used her other hand to grab the weapon and spin it forward. She was able to get the acolyte to face the 2 panels she placed down, using the force to throw the acolyte backwards, and she ran forward herself, slashing quickly. Her blade landed true against the Sith acolyte, before she raised the 2 panels and launched him forward. The red lighting in the hallways made everything all the more dramatic, but the 2 Jedi were able to quickly cut their way through the halls and reunite with each other, so they could continue their push for the control room. Outside the Star Forge, the battle was heating up. The capital ships were really starting to feel the pressure of an elongated battle. The Venators were struggling due to the sheer amount of firepower their shields were taking in. Admiral Coburn tried to get into contact with Cody, but nothing was coming through. He feared for the worst, and then one of his deckhands said that the Sith starboard flank had a couple of their ship's engines engaging. Coburn turned back, seeing one of the Venators explode next to him. He asked what the deckhand said, and he repeated it. Coburn turned his attention outwards, and watched 3 of the capital ships engage their engines and turn hard into the Sith flank. R2, R4, and Mace Windu's droid, R8, who was with the now, had done their jobs. The ship's engines began cooking up and speeding forward. At the same time, the clones quickly evacuated the ships they were in. The LAATs could be seen escaping from the wreckage as the ships they were just in began speeding into the fray. Luckily for the LAATs, most of the fighter fight wasn't on their side of the flank, though just to ensure the protection, Republic anti-fighter corvettes were sent over to provide cover fire. Admiral Yularen called over and reported the damage to Admiral Coburn, as another deckhand informed him that there were a number of vessels approaching from hyperspace. Coburn's heart sank, and then he heard a voice come over the transmission. General Fisto apologized for being so late to the party, as he informed the Admiral that all he needed were some directions for his fleet, and they would provide the adequate reinforcements needed. This was just to replenish what they needed. With most of the shields damaged on the ships helming the front line, Fisto's large fleet from Camino would be the perfect assistance to claim victory. Coburn turned back towards the starboard side of the flank, as he watched the 3 Sith capital ships begin wreaking havoc through their far side of the line. The droid forces didn't know how to counter this. Their programming hadn't prepared them for friendly fire, so their lines were quickly disrupted. Coburn implemented his strategy, and the Republic began their push forward towards the Star Forge. Fisto led a group of fighters from his ships and began to reinforce the Republic side of the fight. Inside the legendary weapon, Anakin and Natabre made their way up to the bridge and started cutting down the droids and crew. They were so ecstatic about their efforts, believing they had shut down the machine. Truthfully, they were both trying to save the weapon from imminent destruction, because if the Republic could use it, then they'd be able to flip the tide of the war. There'd be no worry for the loss of troopers or anything. When the bridge was completely cleared out, Natabre ran over to the window of the control room and saw a nearly completed Sith super destroyer. She called back to Anakin and told him they might want to destroy the control panels. He responded that he didn't believe that destroying them would solve their issue. Anakin suggested they try and shut down the weapon from here. She ran back over and started messing with the panels in the control room. Exar was watching them frolic over the panels with urgency. He of course could mod along over them, but he didn't feel the need to. His weapon was nearly complete, and there was absolutely no reason for him to draw them to his location. As they quickly worked their way through the control room, they found the levers to the station and turned it off, flipping them down. The bridge went silent for a moment, and they quickly ushered themselves to the window. The light was still beaming. Natabre turned to Anakin, and they both knew without saying a word. Somewhere else in the station was operating this weapon. The Republic fleet was inching closer to the weapon too. By this point, the Sith fleet had to actually abandon their post because the Sith Super Destroyer was too large for them to stay in one place. This did assist the Republic in some ways, but in reality, it just made them more vulnerable to a large-scale attack from the Sith forces. With the Sith fleet spreading out, the Republic fleet had to try and quickly counter the Sith forces, but that was simply becoming impossible. They didn't have enough ships to go toe-to-toe with these forces. Despite the success of the fighter assault and the ability of the bombers, the Republic was far too outnumbered to win this battle. Kit Fisto took the helm away from Ahsoka and Zala, who were, not for nothing, frightened in command but holding their own. The two Padawans lined up behind Fisto as they tried to look for a weak spot in the Sith flanks. The clones couldn't pull the same trick they did before, so what could they feasibly do against the Sith forces? Anakin and Natabre had a short panic, but then he remembered, there are always alternatives of fighting. The Sith were doing that. The two Jedi were then able to quickly get themselves up to the location of the throne room, and upon their entry, they were faced with the greatest threat of their lives. Exar sat on his throne with his legs sitting up close to his chest. He smiled and laughed at the Jedi as they entered the room. There were 18 acolytes standing in front of the throne, 9 on each side. Anakin and Natabre walked forward, standing side by side. Their unity with each other was now more important than ever before. Exar didn't move. He just told them that despite his hate for the Jedi, they did well. They were true adversaries in the field of combat, and truthfully, they would have made better Sith. He rose up to his feet and told them that he would have offered them a chance to be Sith, but they had already been too impossibly annoying. He was going to win this battle, and this war, and all they had done was simply prolong an experience that he didn't care to elongate. He told his acolytes to slaughter the Jedi. 18 lightsabers ignited, and they moved forward. Anakin and Natabre backed up. Their lightsabers ignited to face what stood before them. Anakin looked around and thought of what could be done. Exar stepped forward as his acolytes closed in slowly. Exar's smile was shaky. Like each step his troops made, put him one step closer to insanity. The darkness was swelling in the room. Skywalker put his hand up and told Exar that he'd like to challenge him to a duel. The Sith acolytes stopped their slow pursuit and turned towards the Sith Lord. This was perhaps the only thing that could be done in the moment. Exar looked at his acolytes. He knew that if he neglected this fight, he would have at least one traitor, something he didn't care to deal with. His eyes drifted from Skywalker to the viewport. He could see a couple of Republic Venators explode. The battle was coming to an end. While he knew that there was a secondary fleet that arrived, they simply didn't have the time or the numbers to compete with the Sith here. Exar could feel the pressure in the room mounting up on him. The tension between him and the Jedi sat right here. Of course, it would be simple to just have the Jedi executed, but sure, he ignited his lightsaber and told the boy that he would die in a more honorable death than most Jedi. He pointed a lightsaber forward and told Natabre that this fight was between them. She didn't really care for it, but she stepped back. Her eyes drifted around the room, looking for a way to help Anakin in this situation, which is exactly what he was hoping she would do. The Sith all raised their lightsabers to the chest and idly stood. It created a crimson glow similar to what was seen in the hallways earlier when Anakin and Natabre cut through the droid forces and the two acolytes. Anakin held his blade and moved into his form. But instead of his traditional pose, he lowered his shoulders and placed his weapon in front of his face. He was giving the Sith Lord a different look. Exar loved it. For a Jedi to be so different made the thought of gutting Skywalker all the more enjoyable. The death of their order. Exar launched himself forward and Anakin doubled back, going into Obi-Wan's form and protecting himself from the offensive. It was a really awkward transition, and it was clear from the start to Exar that Anakin wasn't fighting in his natural element. He found this to be rather peculiar, but it didn't matter. The Jedi would be killed. Their blades connected again. Anakin was quick on his feet rather than heavy. This allowed him to present differently than how he did before. Despite everything he had seen from Anakin, this wasn't enough to convince him that Anakin was dainty on his feet. Skywalker took this brief stint using an alternative method to fighting to confuse Exar. He threw his blade forward and then blasted Exar back. The Sith Lord stumbled and then regathered his footing. This only made him angrier, and so he let it feed him. His blade drove forward and Skywalker blocked and parried, spinning his blade behind his back and driving forward. Anakin forced his blade and it gave Exar a quick disadvantage. After all of his failures since Tython, Anakin was dedicated to not losing. He threw himself forward harder and more aggressive than ever before. Exar only played off of it. As a former Jedi, he was able to see Anakin's weakness in the moment and turn it into his own advantage. He stepped back, allowing Skywalker to feel control over the moment. Anakin's ferocity was something that the Sith Lord admired, until he slid under a strike made by Anakin and cut up across his ribs outwards. The blade didn't go deep enough to cut through the bone, but it did hurt. Anakin stumbled over and looked back up. Exar taunted him by gloating over him and looking down at his wounded prey. Anakin didn't like this at all, and he allowed his anger to take the best of him in this moment. He rose to his feet and slashed forward, striking Exar when he didn't expect to be struck. His unbalance caught the attention of each of the acolytes watching. Exar didn't like looking weak, so as Anakin was striking forward, taking every advantage he had in beating Exar fair and square, the Sith Lord deignited his weapon and sidestepped Anakin, igniting the blade and swiping up from the back of Anakin's right hip, up across his back, releasing just under the left shoulder of the blade. Anakin cried out in agony as he slammed down to the ground. Natabre was outraged, but surprisingly, not nearly as outraged as the Sith acolytes were. To both the Jedi and the Sith, there were unspoken rules about lightsaber combat, and Exar, after nearly beating Anakin fair and square, gave up his advantage and almost paid for it. The Sith acolytes moved forward. Natabre looked at Anakin as the acolytes approached him, but as Exar championed himself, he turned to see his allies moving in. He assumed they were going to kill Skywalker, but their attention wasn't anywhere remotely close to Anakin. He was defeated, they could deal with him later. Natabre caught attention of it and used what she saw earlier to her advantage. She used the Force to crush a support beam, and a number of massive objects dropped from the ceiling onto the control panels. The moment the panels obliterated, the entire complex began to shake. As the acolytes engaged Exar, they were all collectively thrown from their feet. Natabre looked over. Exar seized the moment and gathered an acolyte's lightsaber and ignited his own, cutting through a number of them while they were all downed. Natabre got up and ran to Anakin's side. He grabbed the hold of her wrist and she helped him up. He asked what happened, and they very quickly moved to the edge of the throne room and looked down. When the Starforge stopped production through force rather than a lack of energy or any other natural stoppage, the forge combusted and the massive ship that was being constructed was blasted out from the center of the forge. They couldn't see the damage done to the forge, but the ship that could be the size of a fleet found some soft cushioning in the fleet that was stationed to protect the Starforge. Initially, this seemed like nothing but positive, though a number of clone pilots were crushed by the explosion. On the brighter side of the destruction, the Republic fleet, which was in shambles, was able to survive said explosion. Inside the throne room, Anakin and Natabre turned back and looked at Exar. He was magnificent with the blade, but no matter how many number of acolytes he killed, they seemed to never stop coming. He moved his weapons quickly, but he was clipped by one of them, before creating, through his rage, a small surge of a force storm, and it blasted out from around him, throwing a third of the surviving acolytes from their feet. They continued their assault on him, and they continued going to work, then being cut across the thigh by an acolyte, and then having his forearm completely removed. Exar was in pure suffering. He watched his weapon become destroyed, and now, he was being gutted by grunts. He used all of his strength to try and get himself out of it. The acolytes kept dropping until an emerald lightsaber ignited in front of him and cut down an acolyte about to strike him before spinning around and thrusting the blade into his stomach. He reeled in pain before a blue lightsaber ignited and blocked his counterstrike. Exar scowled. Natabre drove her blade further into his body as he tried to stop the blade from killing him, but she ripped it upwards. Anakin pulled his blade back and decapitated another acolyte before tumbling over. His injuries were creeping through the pure adrenaline running through his body. Exar had done a fine job. Skywalker tossed Natabre his blade, and she skipped between the three remaining acolytes who threw themselves at her. Anakin watched, waiting for her to pull it off. He believed in her. Natabre's belief in herself was at an all-time high. She spun through the vicious attackers, blocking and elegantly putting on a show of dedication. She clipped an acolyte in the jaw, which dropped them, before she used another acolyte to kill that one, 2 more remaining. One of them already on the ground. She threw her hands up in an X formation to block one of the attackers before spinning back and kicking her foot out to kick the other one back down again. She drove her blades forward, killing the one in front of her. The last one scrambled to his feet and launched himself forward. She reverse gripped her own blade and blocked downwards and used Anakin's blade to slash up. In one moment, the Sith was dropped to the ground. She put the blades away and dropped to her knees amongst the carnage. Her breath was shaky. She looked over at Anakin, who was smiling at her. He was so proud of her. She grinned at him and got to her feet, quickly getting to his side and helping him up. He felt terrible pain as he got up, but she gave him a couple of Bacta tablets to take that would at the very least act as a numbing substitute until they could get him back to a capital ship. Admiral Coburn called over the communications and asked if they were alright. Anakin responded to the call, considering he was much heavier than Natabre and it was a bit of an effort to help lug him back down to the ships. He told the Admiral that they had shut down the weapon. They believed it was too damaged to be operable. Coburn responded telling Skywalker that General Fisto and some medics were being dispatched to his location. They would further investigate the state of the Star Forge. Coburn continued to inform them all that the battle had almost been completely won. For the most part, the Sith fleet was destroyed. With the rout taking place, the Republic fleet was able to obliterate any few ships that hadn't made the jump to hyperspace. Ironically, because Exar planned on using his fleet against his allies, the fleet was already fully programmed to attack any Sith, Republic, and/or Separatist fleet they came in contact with. so they were pretty much doomed wherever they exited hyperspace from. Anakin and Natabre got to the hangar bay, and she set him down gently on a ship, where she sat down next to him. She had him leaning against her, simply due to the injury he sustained. In this moment, the two of them were able to talk to each other. They both were extremely thankful for the other, for having been there for them in that moment. Natabre told Anakin that she wasn't quite sure how she felt about his alternative means to fighting, being challenging a Sith Lord, but she expressed that Obi-Wan certainly would have been proud of him, and she was too. The two of them felt closer than ever before. Surviving this encounter was more than any of them could have ever imagined. The odds were stacked against them, but perhaps with a little challenge to the orthodox, they were able to take those odds and make them favorable for themselves. An LAAT arrived in the hangar bay, and a couple clone medics rushed out and grabbed General Skywalker and ushered him into the LAAT, so they could get him medical attention immediately. While the cut in his ribs wasn't terrible, the strike from his hip to his shoulder blade was much worse. Not fully deep, but some of his bones had been scraped and a number of his muscles were damaged by it. When Master Fisto arrived, he came with Commander Cody, who had rerouted the LAAT to the Star Forge once the battle was over. With Cody were a handful of clone engineers who would investigate the status of the weapon. Master Fisto told Natabre that she and Skywalker should be proud of themselves. He walked up to her and told her that no other Jedi had won against two Sith Lords, let alone one. Their duo was one of the finer things to come out of this travesty. She smiled and nodded her head. She expressed that without each other, they'd be nothing. Both of them needed the other, and without that other, they'd be incomplete. Fisto just smiled as he asked her to come along with him. On the way to the control room, she asked about the damage from space, and she was informed about the casualties. 6 of the Venators from the original fleet had been destroyed. Admiral Yularen's flagship, which still held Master Windu, was very badly damaged, and if it wasn't for her and Anakin, Yularen and Windu would have been killed. Admiral Coburn's efforts were quite remarkable, and Fisto expressed that he would likely become a fleet admiral when everything was said and done. In the control room, they restarted the forge and then went through the schematics of the machine. Fisto was repulsed. He didn't realize that the Star Forge had to eat a star to function. In hindsight, maybe the Jedi should have seen it coming. Star and Forge. Yeah, that checks out. Regardless, as it turns out, the Jedi could operate this weapon. Natabre asked Master Fisto if it would at all be responsible for the Jedi to kill stars and destroy planets full of so much life as a means to power the war effort. Master Fisto looked at her and told her that he truthfully didn't know anymore, but he did know that what the Jedi did with the weapon would be a telltale of what the effects of the war were on the Order itself. Hours later, instead of Admiral Coburn's Venator, Skywalker would be sleeping off some Bacta that had been given the numbest pain. He had some time to himself inside the Bacta tank, but now he was lying on a medical bed. As he was lying here, his eyes darted open. He could feel something, or maybe it was hear something. A student in Zala had been in and out of the room, but all there was at the moment was Natabre by his side. She was sleeping at the moment. Anakin looked over at her and felt peace wash over him. He lowered himself back down and his eyes felt a looming shadow sitting next to him, and he turned over to see a tall figure with a massive hood over their head. In a flash, he was gone. His hand jolted out and grabbed Natabre's arm, which woke her up in a startle. She looked at him, and all he could do is look towards the doorway and repeat the words that had just been said to him. "Come to me, boy." And that, my friends, is Season 2 of the Sith Clone Wars. Special thanks to all of our patrons, all of you for making this series happen. This is one of the most fun series I think I've ever done in my life. I'm having so much fun with this, and I hope you guys are as well. That is the entire purpose of this. I will be honest with you guys, I have an outline, a 10-episode outline for Season 3 already finished. If you guys want to see it, let me know down below. And tomorrow there'll be a poll, so make sure you vote on that poll for the continuation of the Sith Clone Wars. Otherwise, I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.